It was a crisp autumn morning when I arrived at my Uncle Robert's farm, just in time to witness something I never imagined possible. There he was, my 72-year-old uncle, wearing faded denim overalls and a weathered trucker hat, casually sipping his morning coffee on the porch of his old farmhouse. He looked like he had all the time in the world, perfectly content as the sun cast long, golden shadows across the property. But everything was about to change. From a distance, I saw them heavy-duty construction trucks rumbling down the dirt road, their wheels kicking up dust like a storm on the horizon. I didn't think much of it at first. I assumed it was just routine road work or maybe some maintenance on the neighboring properties. But as I got closer, my stomach dropped. I realized, with a sinking feeling, that these trucks were headed straight for the creek behind Uncle Robert's house. And there, standing proudly in the center of it all, was the Bridges Bridge. This bridge wasn't just any old structure. It was a relic from the past, built with stone from a long-abandoned quarry that had once been used during the Civil War. Uncle Robert had personally restored it over the course of several years, and it stood as both a symbol of his connection to the land and a testament to his deep love for history. The bridge marked the boundary between his land and the creek, a spot that had been the same since the very first settlers arrived. It wasn't just a bridge. It was part of the fabric of his life. But the HOA had other plans. It started innocently enough, with a complaint here and there, followed by vague suggestions from the newly elected president, Margaret, who had recently taken control of the local neighborhood aesthetic committee. They started with small things: flowers, yard ornaments, even the placement of mailboxes. But Margaret, with her smug smile and condescending tone, soon set her sights on the one thing she thought would be an easy target: Uncle Robert's historic bridge. She said it clashed with the modern aesthetic of the neighborhood. Never mind that it had stood for over a century without issue. She claimed it was a safety hazard, an eyesore, and this was the best part: a symbol of outdated thinking. Margaret went as far as to hire a local inspector to give a fabricated report on the bridge's structural integrity. Of course, the report was a complete joke, but that didn't stop her from slapping an official-looking notice of removal sticker on it, complete with a bold red stamp that read "Non-compliance, immediate action required." When Uncle Robert received that letter, he didn't flinch. He knew exactly what he was dealing with. He spent the next day poring over the deed to the property, land use laws, and historical preservation codes. He wrote a letter, one that laid out every single legal right he had to keep the bridge standing, including a detailed history of the bridge's restoration and its cultural significance. He even included a list of state and federal protections that guaranteed its preservation. It was a beautiful letter, one that would make any lawyer proud. But Margaret didn't back down. In fact, she doubled down. She responded with another letter, this time filled with more vague threats. But Uncle Robert, calm as ever, simply sent her a copy of the letter he had written, adding one line at the bottom: "Return to sender and lawful nonsense." And yet, Margaret's actions only escalated. One morning, just as the sun began to rise, I pulled into the driveway of Uncle Robert's farm and saw the heavy machinery. I watched in disbelief as they lined up near the creek. My heart skipped a beat. Uncle Robert had been right. Margaret wasn't playing games anymore. She had come to destroy something irreplaceable. I rushed to find him, calling out his name as I sprinted toward the creek. But when I reached the edge, Uncle Robert was still there, sitting on the old wooden bench by the bridge, as calm as ever. He didn't seem worried at all. In fact, he looked almost amused as he watched the construction workers preparing to tear down the bridge. He didn't stand up or shout at them. Instead, he simply took a slow sip from his coffee, as if this were just another day in his long, peaceful life. "Uncle Robert, you need to get out of there," I yelled, panic rising in my chest. But he looked up at me and smiled, as if he'd been expecting this moment all along. "This bridge," he said softly, "has stood through to world wars and countless storms. It's not going anywhere, not while I'm still here." Before I could respond, the bulldozer revved its engine and barreled toward the bridge. Uncle Robert stood up, took one last sip of his coffee, and stepped off the bridge with the grace of someone who had nothing left to prove. The moment he stepped onto solid ground, the bridge collapsed behind him in a slow, heartbreaking cascade of wood and stone, like the loss of an old friend. Margaret stood at the edge of the creek, watching the destruction unfold, and as the last piece of the bridge fell into the water, she turned to me with a smug smile and said, "It's over." But as the dust settled, Uncle Robert turned to me with a quiet, knowing look. "They made a mistake," he said. "The real fight is just beginning." And in that moment, I knew that my uncle, calm as always, had already begun planning his next move. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of the war. Uncle Robert's response to Margaret's actions was everything I expected: measured, calm, and precise. The destruction of the bridge wasn't just an attack on an old piece of history. It was a direct challenge to Uncle Robert's legacy. But what struck me the most was how he didn't respond with rage or emotional outbursts. He didn't storm around or shout at the HOA board members like most people would have done. Instead, he set to work, quietly preparing for what he knew was going to be an uphill legal battle. That evening, after the bulldozer had finished its work and the remnants of the bridge were reduced to rubble, Uncle Robert didn't seem angry. He wasn't even frustrated. He simply turned to me and said, "They've made a grave mistake, but they're about to learn a hard lesson." It was clear to me now that this was never just about a bridge. It was about power, respect, and rights. Margaret and her HOA board had crossed a line, not just legally, but morally. And Uncle Robert wasn't going to let them get away with it. As I watched him gather papers and old photographs of the bridge, I realized how deep his connection to this place really was. It wasn't just about the structure itself. It was about the generations who had built and maintained it. The bridge symbolized the values of hard work, preservation, and standing firm in the face of adversity. And Margaret, with her clipboard and inflated sense of authority, thought she could simply wipe it away. Uncle Robert wasted no time. He started drafting a letter, not just any letter, but a carefully crafted document that would lay out the full scope of the legal protections the bridge had. He didn't just rely on state law brought in federal heritage protections, citing the historical significance of the bridge and how it had been restored with funds from a federal grant for historical preservation. The letter was thorough, detailed, and it left no room for misunderstanding. It wasn't just a letter, it was a legal weapon, meticulously designed to make Margaret's actions look not only reckless, but completely unlawful. I watched him as he sat at the kitchen table, the glow from the lamp above illuminating his weathered face. His hands moved with precision as he wrote, every word measured. There was no haste in his movements, no signs of anger. He had seen this kind of situation before, a battle where emotion could cloud judgment and derail the fight, but not Uncle Robert. He wasn't going to let anger dictate his strategy. Instead, he was building a case, brick by brick, ensuring that when the time came, it wouldn't just be a personal victory, it would be a message to anyone who thought they could destroy history for the sake of convenience. "Margaret doesn't understand the gravity of what she's done," he said to me one night after finishing the letter, "but she will. She'll understand when she's sitting across from a judge, explaining why she thought she could just tear down a national landmark for the sake of neighborhood aesthetics." I nodded, not fully understanding the intricacies of the legal battle we were about to face, but trusting in my uncle's confidence. He had spent his life in the courtroom, and if there was one thing he was good at, it was making sure that justice wasn't just done, it was done the right way. The next day, he made some calls, first to the county office to confirm the status of the bridge's historical protection. He also reached out to a few of his old colleagues from the legal world, gathering information and support from people who understood the weight of this case. Everyone Uncle Robert contacted shared one thing in common: they respected the law, and they recognized that this wasn't just about a fight within HOA. It was a fight for the very principles that held society together: property rights, historical preservation, and above all, justice. By that afternoon, Uncle Robert had a plan in motion. He had contacted a local lawyer who specialized in property disputes, and together they started gathering the evidence they needed to take Margaret and the HOA to court. But he wasn't just preparing for a typical property dispute. Uncle Robert had already anticipated the HOA's likely defense. They would claim they acted in good faith, that they believed the bridge was a liability, and that their actions were justified under the HOA's bylaws. But Uncle Robert wasn't buying that for a second. He knew deep down that Margaret's entire campaign had been built on lies and manipulation. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, emails, and legal paperwork. As Uncle Robert sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of documents and historical records, I could see the resolve in his eyes. This wasn't just about winning a lawsuit. This was about teaching a lesson. And he wasn't going to rest until that lesson was learned not just by Margaret, but by anyone who thought they could use their position of power to tear down something that didn't belong to them. One evening, as he finished drafting yet another letter, this one directed at the state's historical preservation committee, looked at me and smiled. "They'll regret this," he said calmly, "because when you fight for something that's right, the universe has a way of lining up to help you." It was that unwavering confidence that made me believe Uncle Robert would win. He wasn't just fighting for a bridge, he was fighting for the values that mattered: truth, justice, and the belief that no one, no matter how powerful they thought they were, could tear down what was rightfully his. The battle had only just begun. But one thing was certain: Margaret and her HOA would not win this time. Uncle Robert had already laid the groundwork for their defeat, and the weight of his experience in the courtroom was about to make all the difference. After the bridge was destroyed, Uncle Robert didn't waste any time wallowing in regret or anger. He was quiet, but there was an unmistakable look in his eyes that spoke volumes. This was a man who had lost something dear, but it wasn't the kind of loss that made him break down or lash out. He was calm, composed, and already moving into action. I didn't expect him to fall apart, but I also didn't expect how quickly he would shift gears from grief to action. As I stood there watching him calmly assess the wreckage, I realized that the destruction of the bridge wasn't the end of his fight. It was just the beginning of something much bigger. That evening, Uncle Robert got to work, immediately diving into the legal battle he knew was coming. He didn't yell at the contractors or lash out at the HOA. Instead, he focused. He knew exactly what he needed to do next. He sat at the kitchen table, the soft hum of the old lamp overhead casting a warm light on the papers strewn around him. Uncle Robert wasn't just preparing to file a lawsuit. He was meticulously laying out his case with precision, as if this were a case he had been building for years. I watched as he gathered the documents that would support his claim: photos of the bridge, records of its restoration, even historical documents that proved its significance. Uncle Robert wasn't just fighting for a piece of property. He was fighting for something that mattered far more, something rooted in history, culture, and his sense of justice. The more he worked, the more I realized that this wasn't going to be just a legal case for him. It was a chance to restore not only the bridge, but also the respect that had been taken from him by a small, arrogant HOA led by someone like Margaret. In the midst of preparing the legal documentation, Uncle Robert made several phone calls, some to old colleagues from his days as a judge, others to local lawyers who specialized in property rights and historic preservation. Everyone he called shared the same opinion: Margaret and her HOA had crossed a line. They had overstepped their bounds, and now they would have to face the consequences. Uncle Robert wasn't just relying on the local legal team. He was going big. He called the state's historical preservation office, and within hours, they had confirmed that the bridge was not only a piece of local history, but had also been listed for federal protection. The more information Uncle Robert gathered, the clearer it became that Margaret's actions were not just foolish, they were illegal. The next day, Uncle Robert began drafting his letters. He started with the HOA, sending them an official notice demanding accountability for the destruction of the bridge. But that was just the start. He knew Margaret would try to hide behind some legal loophole. So he took the extra step of preparing a letter for the local media. He wanted to make sure that everyone knew what had happened, not just to the bridge, but to the very principles that this neighborhood was supposed to stand for. Uncle Robert wasn't a man of grand gestures or flashy displays. He didn't need to throw a tantrum to make his point. No, his strength lay in his ability to strategize, to carefully consider every move, and then execute it with calm efficiency. He understood the power of the law, and more importantly, he understood that the truth, when armed with the right evidence, was an unshakable force. He was going to make sure that Margaret and her HOA didn't just lose a lawsuit, they would lose everything they thought they had the power to control. As I watched him work, I felt a mix of admiration and disbelief. I'd always known my uncle was a force to be reckoned with, but seeing him in action like this, so focused, so determined, was something else entirely. This wasn't just a fight to win a case, this was a fight to make a point. And Uncle Robert wasn't going to stop until that point was made clear to everyone, from the HOA to the entire neighborhood. By the end of the day, Uncle Robert had prepared everything he needed: documents, photographs, official statements, and legal advice. He was ready, and though he remained calm, there was no mistaking the fire in his eyes. The battle had begun, and he was going to make sure that Margaret and her HOA would pay the price for their overreach. The next morning, as he walked me through the final preparations, he said something that stuck with me. "This isn't just about a bridge," he said. "This is about showing people that there are lines you don't cross, and when you do, you have to answer for it." His words rang true in that moment, and I knew Uncle Robert wasn't just fighting for something small. He was fighting for justice, for property rights, and for a community that had been wronged. The fight was only just beginning, but if there was anyone who could win it, it was him. Uncle Robert had already prepared for the worst, but he also knew that this battle would take time. And he was patient, knew that patience, combined with the right legal tools, was a weapon no one could defeat. Margaret had made a grave mistake by underestimating him, and now, it was time for her to face the consequences. Despite having thoroughly prepared for the legal battle, Uncle Robert maintained a terrifying level of calm. I expected him to jump into action immediately, but instead, he proceeded slowly, precisely, and with meticulous attention to detail. After sending out his demand letters and preparing a stack of documents proving the HOA's wrongful actions, Uncle Robert didn't rush. He took his time, waiting for a response. A whole week passed with no word from Margaret or the HOA. But for Uncle Robert, this wasn't a problem. He understood that this fight wouldn't be over quickly, and he didn't expect Margaret to come to her senses. However, the silence didn't frustrate him. Instead, he spent his time continuing to search for more evidence and confirm the authenticity of the materials he had already gathered. One of the things he did was reach out to experts in historical preservation, asking them to verify the legal protections the bridge was under. During that time, it became crystal clear to me just how methodical and patient Uncle Robert was. Even though he had the legal power and the knowledge of the law on his side, he chose not to rush. He knew that when you have solid evidence and sound reasoning, everything would fall into place eventually. This wasn't a fight to win quickly, it was a fight to protect something valuable and to make sure those who had wronged him understood the consequences of their actions. One afternoon, as I was helping him organize his files, a letter finally arrived from the HOA. But what I didn't expect was that it wasn't an apology or an acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Instead, it was a response, filled with anger and denial of every accusation Uncle Robert had made. In the letter, Margaret not only rejected his demands, but also threatened to take the matter to court, claiming that Uncle Robert had violated the community's best interests by defending a worthless heritage structure. When Uncle Robert read that letter aloud, there was no visible reaction from him. He simply set it down, looked at me, and said, "Well, it seems they're not backing down after all." But despite the hostility in the letter, Uncle Robert didn't lose his composure. Instead, he doubled down on his plan. He knew that Margaret and the HOA were playing with fire. But he also knew how to control the situation. He wasn't about to let her dictate the narrative, and he certainly wasn't going to let them turn this into a personal attack. Uncle Robert was calm, but there was a fire burning inside him. A deep conviction that he wasn't just fighting for a bridge, he was fighting for what was right. He spent the next few days refining his legal strategy. He didn't rush to file anything in court just yet, knowing that he needed a strong case, one that would stand up against whatever the HOA might throw at him. He continued to gather support, consulting legal experts and drawing up plans to secure a stronger foothold in the upcoming battle. One of the most crucial pieces of evidence was a letter he had received from the state's Historical Preservation Office, confirming that the bridge had been under active protection and that any attempt to destroy it without proper legal process was a violation of both state and federal law. Meanwhile, the silence from the HOA continued. They didn't send any further responses to Uncle Robert's letters, but it was clear that Margaret was beginning to feel the pressure. The quiet in the neighborhood was palpable, and as Uncle Robert continued his preparations, it was almost as though the entire community was waiting for the next move. When the moment came, Uncle Robert filed the official claim, but not before ensuring that every document was airtight. He even included expert testimonies and photographs of the bridge, its historical significance, and the wrongful destruction. He wasn't just filing a lawsuit. He was setting up a case that would make it nearly impossible for Margaret or the HOA to escape the consequences of their actions. As the days passed, I saw Uncle Robert become more focused. He wasn't just preparing for a legal battle, was preparing to make a statement. Every letter, every piece of evidence, and every conversation was part of a larger plan to make sure that Margaret's actions were not only corrected, but also publicly exposed for what they truly were, an abuse of power. Uncle Robert wasn't just fighting for the bridge. He was fighting for the very principles of justice and the rule of law. And through it all, Uncle Robert remained calm. There was no shouting, no outbursts of anger, just a quiet, steely determination that spoke volumes. He understood the stakes better than anyone, and he knew that in the end, his patience and resolve would be what saw him through. The fight was far from over, but Uncle Robert had already made up his mind. He wasn't just going to win. He was going to make sure Margaret and her HOA understood that their actions had consequences, and those consequences were coming. Uncle Robert's next move was swift and calculated. After the HOA's dismissive letter, which tried to downplay the severity of their actions and shift the blame onto him, Uncle Robert had a decision to make: fight back legally, but also in a way that would leave no room for them to wiggle out. He wasn't just going to win this case. He was going to make sure that Margaret and her HOA were held accountable for the damage they had done, and that the lesson would be lasting. As expected, the HOA didn't respond to his legal challenges with any sense of humility. Instead, they doubled down. Margaret's defiance was no surprise to Uncle Robert. She was the type of person who believed that the law could be bent to fit her will, that her position as the HOA president gave her the power to act above the law. But Uncle Robert wasn't like the others in the neighborhood who had quietly accepted the HOA's increasingly ridiculous demands. He understood that fighting for what was right was more important than appeasing the petty tyrants. In the days following the arrival of the letter, Uncle Robert worked tirelessly. He continued to gather evidence, making calls to historians, contractors, and legal experts to reinforce his case. He meticulously documented every threat and action taken by the HOA, including Margaret's forged demolition orders and the unsanctioned destruction of the bridge. Each piece of evidence, no matter how small, was part of a bigger puzzle that, when pieced together, would show that Margaret's entire campaign had been one of deception and overreach. Uncle Robert was a man who understood the value of patience. The more the HOA tried to downplay their actions, the more he knew he had to methodically build his case. He was careful not to act too quickly, allowing Margaret to dig herself deeper into a hole. He even began working with the media, preparing a press release to make the public aware of the situation. Uncle Robert was no stranger to publicity, knew that shining a light on the HOA's actions would put pressure on them in ways they couldn't ignore. The next week, the local newspaper picked up the story. A small column appeared, detailing the destruction of the historic bridge and the subsequent legal battle. It didn't name Margaret directly, but the HOA's involvement was clear. The story stirred up the community. Neighbors who had previously kept their heads down began to take notice. The idea of a private citizen standing up to an overreaching HOA resonated with them, and for the first time, many of them started questioning the HOA's authority. Was Margaret really acting in the best interests of the neighborhood, or was she simply flexing her power because she could? Uncle Robert didn't stop there. Armed with new information and growing public support, he contacted an old friend, Jody, an attorney with a deep understanding of property law and historic preservation. Jody had worked with Uncle Robert on several high-profile cases, and they both knew that having her in his corner would make a significant difference. Jody was a fierce advocate, and with her expertise, Uncle Robert felt even more confident that they could win this fight. Together, they began to draft a complaint that would lay out the full extent of the HOA's wrongdoing. This wasn't just a simple property dispute. It was an attack on something far more significant, an attack on history itself. The bridge wasn't just a structure, it was a symbol of the community's past, built with the sweat and determination of previous generations. Margaret, in her short-sightedness, had chosen to destroy that symbol, and Uncle Robert wasn't going to let her get away with it. As they prepared to file the lawsuit, Uncle Robert took one final step. He reached out to the state's Historical Preservation Office. He had been in contact with them before, but this time, he asked them to formally intervene. He knew the bridge had been listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and he wanted to ensure that the state understood the gravity of the situation. If the state could step in, it would be the final nail in the coffin for Margaret's plans. Uncle Robert knew that Margaret would try to argue that the HOA had acted in good faith. After all, it was in their bylaws to protect the neighborhood's aesthetic, and the bridge, in their view, didn't fit. But Uncle Robert wasn't buying it. He knew that even if they tried to claim it was a mistake, the legal ramifications were clear. The bridge was under federal protection, and the HOA had no right to tear it down without proper authorization. And they certainly had no right to act without consulting the proper authorities, especially when they were dealing with a structure of historical significance. The morning the lawsuit was filed, Uncle Robert sat back with a sense of quiet satisfaction. He had done everything by the book. Every I was dotted, every T crossed, and he knew that once the case hit the courtroom, there would be no escaping the truth. Margaret and her HOA would be forced to answer for their reckless actions. That night, as Uncle Robert sat in his favorite chair by the fireplace, sipping a glass of scotch, he looked at me and said, "They think they can just bulldoze their way through life, but they don't understand the power of what they've taken on. When you fight for something that matters, it's never just about winning. It's about making sure people know the cost of their actions." And just like that, I knew this fight wasn't just about a bridge anymore. It was about standing up to those who thought they could destroy what they didn't understand, and about reminding them that the law was not something you could ignore, just because you had a little bit of power. Uncle Robert was calm, but in that calmness, I could see the storm that was about to hit the HOA. Margaret had made her move. Now, it was time for Uncle Robert to make his. The moment Uncle Robert filed the lawsuit, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted. It wasn't just about the bridge anymore, it was about standing up to a system that had been allowed to run unchecked. The HOA, which once seemed like a minor annoyance, was now facing a full-scale legal battle. And Uncle Robert wasn't just going to sit back and let them defend themselves in the usual way. He was going to make sure that this case wasn't just about a dispute over property, but about the very principles of justice, fairness, and accountability. In the days following the filing, the quiet of the neighborhood was replaced with a palpable tension. People started talking. There were murmurs at the grocery store, conversations at the coffee shop, and curious glances from neighbors as they passed by Uncle Robert's house. Some of them had always quietly accepted the HOA's arbitrary rules, but now they were starting to question whether Margaret's actions had crossed a line. This wasn't just about the bridge, it was about a larger issue of power and control. And people were starting to realize that they had a stake in this fight too. Uncle Robert knew this was the perfect time to turn the tide in his favor. He wasn't just going to fight the HOA in court, he was going to rally the community behind him. He started reaching out to people, talking to those who had been affected by the HOA's overreach. It wasn't just about the destruction of the bridge, it was about the way Margaret and her board had made life difficult for everyone in the neighborhood. The HOA had started to act like a small government, wielding power over the smallest details of people's lives, from lawn maintenance to the color of their mailboxes. Uncle Robert had seen the toll it had taken on his neighbors, and he wasn't about to let that go unchallenged. By the time the court date was set, Uncle Robert had gathered a coalition of neighbors who were willing to testify in his favor. Some were former members of the HOA, others had simply been the victims of the board's petty rules. All of them understood the gravity of the situation. It wasn't just about the bridge anymore. It was about showing Margaret and the HOA that they couldn't trample on people's rights without consequences. But it wasn't just the neighbors who were starting to get involved. The media, which had picked up on the story of the destroyed bridge, started following Uncle Robert's case closely. The local newspaper ran a follow-up story, detailing the legal action Uncle Robert had taken against the HOA, and the community's growing support for his fight. People from outside the neighborhood started taking notice. It wasn't just a local story anymore, it was a battle for the integrity of communities everywhere. The narrative was clear. A man was standing up for what was right, and a corrupt HOA was trying to erase a piece of history for their own gain. The press coverage put even more pressure on the HOA. Margaret, who had once strutted around the neighborhood with an air of superiority, now found herself in a public relations nightmare. Her earlier smugness was replaced by defensive statements and legal threats, but she couldn't hide the fact that the truth was on Uncle Robert's side. The media began to dig deeper into the HOA's past actions, uncovering more instances of overreach and mistreatment of residents. It was no longer just about a historic bridge, it was about exposing a pattern of behavior that had been allowed to fester for far too long. Uncle Robert, on the other hand, remained calm and collected. He never sought the spotlight. He simply wanted justice. But as the case gained traction, he became a symbol of resistance. Neighbors who had been too afraid to speak out against the HOA began to find their voices. They saw Uncle Robert as a beacon of hope, someone who wasn't afraid to stand up to the bullies and demand accountability. The legal battle wasn't without its challenges. Margaret and her legal team fought tooth and nail to dismiss the case, making weak arguments about the HOA's right to govern the neighborhood and the alleged safety hazards posed by the bridge. They even tried to drag the case out, hoping to wear Uncle Robert down with delays and technicalities. But every time they made a move, Uncle Robert was one step ahead, countering with solid evidence and airtight arguments. The more the HOA tried to stall, the more the community rallied behind him. Uncle Robert's approach was methodical, and he knew that the best way to win this case was to stay focused on the law. But there was something more than just legal strategy driving him. It was a sense of duty. He wasn't just fighting for the bridge. He was fighting for the principles that held his community together. He knew that if he could defeat the HOA, it would send a message to every neighborhood where similar abuses of power were occurring. People didn't have to tolerate overbearing rules and arbitrary decisions made by a few self-appointed leaders. As the day of the trial drew closer, Uncle Robert's resolve only grew stronger. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was ready for whatever came his way. His legal team, bolstered by the support of his neighbors and the growing public awareness, was ready to take the fight to the courtroom. And Margaret, once so sure of her power, was starting to realize that her little HOA empire was crumbling under the weight of its own arrogance. When the day finally arrived, the courtroom was packed, the judge called the case to order, and the proceedings began. Uncle Robert stood tall, his posture unwavering. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about all the people who had been silenced by the HOA's overreach. The legal battle was just one part of a much larger story, a story of standing up to power, of fighting for what's right, and of ensuring that justice would prevail. Margaret had made her move, but now it was time for Uncle Robert to make his, and he wasn't backing down. The day of the trial arrived, and the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Uncle Robert, calm as ever, sat at the plaintiff's table, his hands folded neatly in front of him. It was hard to believe that the man who had been the calm center of our family for years was about to face off against Margaret and the entire HOA in a battle for justice. But as I sat beside him, I realized that this was exactly where Uncle Robert belonged, at the center of a fight that meant something bigger than any one person. The courtroom was packed with people, more than I had expected. Some were neighbors who had come to show their support. Others were just members of the community, curious about the outcome of this high-profile case. It felt like the entire town had turned out to witness what was now being called the trial of the HOA tyrant, a case that had captured the public's imagination. It wasn't just about a bridge anymore. It was about power, control, and the fundamental rights of individuals to protect what was theirs. It was about standing up to someone who thought they could tear down history for the sake of a petty personal vendetta. The judge, a middle-aged man with a stern but fair expression, called the case to order. Margaret sat across from us, flanked by her lawyer, Brock, who looked as if he had just walked off the set of a low-budget legal drama. He wore sunglasses on top of his head and carried a briefcase that looked far more like a prop than a legal tool. Margaret, in her bright red suit and overly confident demeanor, glanced around the courtroom like a performer stepping onto a stage. She was ready to put on a show. Uncle Robert, by contrast, wasn't there to perform. He didn't need to. He was there to present the truth, and as he did so, I could see how deeply he believed in the righteousness of his cause. He wasn't just defending the bridge. He was defending something much bigger, the idea that no one, not even the most arrogant HOA president, could destroy something that belonged to the community, something that had been built with history, effort, and love. The trial began with opening statements. Brock, ever the showman, stood up first. His argument was simple. Margaret and the HOA were simply trying to improve the neighborhood, and the bridge was an eyesore that had been causing safety concerns for years. He emphasized the need for a fresh start, a common mantra used by people who were too eager to erase the past, to make room for their own vision of the future. As he spoke, Margaret nodded in agreement, her face twisted into a smug grin. It was clear that she believed she was in control. But then it was Uncle Robert's turn. He stood slowly, adjusted his blazer, and looked around the courtroom. His presence was commanding, even without saying a word. When he spoke, his voice was calm but firm, every word deliberate. He didn't need to raise his voice to make his point, simply stated the facts and the law with the precision of a surgeon. "This is not about an eyesore," he began. "This is about the preservation of history. This bridge, which has stood for over 100 years, represents more than just wood and stone. It is a piece of this community's past, a past that is protected by both state and federal law." Margaret, with her insistence on erasing it, is not acting in the best interest of the community. She is acting in her own personal interest, driven by a petty desire for control. Uncle Robert then went on to outline the numerous laws that protected the bridge, including the historical preservation statutes and the grant funding it had received. He didn't need to raise his voice. His knowledge of the law and his belief in its power were enough to command attention. The courtroom was silent as he continued, and even Margaret seemed to lose her composure for a moment, her confident posture faltering as the weight of Uncle Robert's words sank in. The witnesses called to the stand were equally important. First, there was Mitchell, the contractor who had been hired by the HOA to destroy the bridge. His testimony was critical. As he sat on the witness stand, he looked uncomfortable. his hands shaking slightly as he recounted how Margaret had paid him in cash and provided him with forged demolition permits. He was forced to do it, he explained, because he feared the HOA would blacklist him from future work in the neighborhood. The weight of his words hung in the air as he confirmed everything that Uncle Robert had claimed, that Margaret had acted without proper authority, using deceit to justify her actions. Uncle Robert didn't need to say. McMitchell's testimony spoke for itself. The courtroom gasped when the contractor revealed that Margaret had even suggested, "They destroy the bridge before the state could stop us." The words echoed in the room, a clear admission of intent to bypass the law entirely. Then came Lena from the state's Historical Preservation Office. Her testimony was the final nail in the coffin for Margaret's defense. She provided detailed documentation that the bridge had been listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and explained how its destruction was a direct violation of federal and state laws. Every fact she presented painted Margaret's actions as not just irresponsible, but criminal. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when Margaret herself took the stand. As she sat down, I could see the nervousness in her eyes, though she tried her best to mask it with a confident smile. She claimed that the bridge was a liability, that it was unsafe, and that the neighborhood would be better off without it. But as Uncle Robert calmly asked her to clarify the specifics of the safety concerns, she faltered. She had no permits, no structural assessments, and no real justification for her actions. All she had was her desire to control the neighborhood. Uncle Robert's cross-examination was masterful. "You do realize," he asked, "that by destroying this bridge, you violated not just local codes, but federal law, didn't you?" Margaret, flustered, mumbled something about safety and aesthetic concerns, but it was clear that her arguments were falling apart. In the end, the verdict was swift. The judge found the HOA guilty of unlawful destruction of federal property, fraudulent misrepresentation, and a violation of multiple laws governing historical preservation. Margaret was personally held responsible for orchestrating the destruction of the bridge, and was ordered to pay restitution for the damages. The bridge was to be rebuilt to its original specifications, under the supervision of state officials. As Uncle Robert walked out of the courtroom, I could see the relief on his face, but also something else: quiet satisfaction. He hadn't just won a case. He had sent a message. No one, not even the HOA, was above the law. In the days that followed, the neighborhood began to change. People who had once feared speaking out against the HOA started to realize that they had a voice. Uncle Robert's victory wasn't just a personal win, it was a win for every resident who had ever been silenced by the HOA's overreach. Margaret's reign of petty power was over, and the community was starting to heal. As for the bridge, it was rebuilt with the help of the very people who had once feared the HOA. And with it, a sense of unity returned to the neighborhood. Lesson for the audience: the story of Uncle Robert and his battle against the HOA is more than just a tale of legal strategy and courtroom drama. It's a story about standing up for what's right, no matter how daunting the odds might seem. In a world where powerful organizations often try to bulldoze over the rights of individuals, Uncle Robert showed us that there's power in patience, knowledge, and above all, the truth. His calm determination and methodical approach remind us that we don't always need to raise our voices to be heard. Sometimes the strength lies in knowing the facts and letting them speak for themselves. Uncle Robert's victory wasn't just about winning a lawsuit. It was about protecting something larger than himself, something that was built over generations, and that meant something to the community. He fought not for personal gain, but to ensure that the voice of reason, justice, and history would never be silenced by those in positions of power. So, the lesson here is simple: stand firm in what you believe is right. Do your homework, and when the time comes, fight for what you value, because in the end, truth and justice will always prevail. Uncle Robert's victory was a turning point, not just for him, but for the entire community. His legal battle against Margaret and the HOA didn't just restore a piece of history. It brought people together, reminding them that standing up for the truth can change everything. The bridge was rebuilt, but so was the trust between neighbors who had once feared speaking out against the HOA's overreach. Now, they were united in their belief that they had a voice and that their rights would not be trampled on again. Uncle Robert had won not just for himself, but for every single person who had ever felt powerless against those who misused their authority. As the final beam was set in place, and the bridge stood tall once more, it wasn't just a symbol of history, it was a symbol of resilience and community. And in that moment, Uncle Robert looked out at the restored bridge, smiled, and said, "Sometimes you have to tear something down to rebuild it the right way." Thank you for joining us in this incredible journey of resilience, justice, and community. If you enjoyed Uncle Robert's story and found inspiration in his fight for what's right, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment below and share your thoughts. Would you stand up in a similar situation? We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to like this video if you believe, like we do, that the power of the truth can change the world. Stay tuned for more stories like this. And remember, when you stand strong for justice, you're never alone.